From beautiful downtown Milwaukee, the mecca of mythicism, it's the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. Keeping the all-seeing eye of Horus on the secular movement. Produced weekly by Mythicist Milwaukee and sponsored by Atheist Community of Milwaukee, Kenosha Racine Atheists and Freethinkers, and King's Tower Productions. The Mythicist Milwaukee Show highlights movers and shakers from the global secular movement and explores the mythic origins of today's major religions. From beautiful downtown Milwaukee, the mecca of mythicism, it's the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. Keeping the all-seeing eye of Horus on the secular movement. Produced weekly by Mythicist Milwaukee and sponsored by Atheist Community of Milwaukee, Kenosha Racine Atheists and Freethinkers, and King's Tower Productions. The Mythicist Milwaukee Show highlights movers and shakers from the global secular movement and explores the mythic origins of today's major religions. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Rob Moore, the deacon of doubt in these parts and the affirmed asshole of atheism, as it turns out today. But that's my lot in life. Thanks for joining us. It's the podcast that puts God last as we keep an all-seeing eye of Horus on the secular movement. We traditionally like to have a co-host, and today it's none other than producer Sean Frasek. He's the man who drives the whole thing around here. What's going on today, Sean?
Not much. Excited to have David in the studio, but I do love that you told him we were family friendly, and the first thing you start off with is, I'm the asshole of atheism.
Well, in my family, they're used to me being an asshole, so it is family. It is family friendly, no. I tease because we all feel like that from time to time. We of course discuss weekly mythicism and topics of interest to the secular community in general. And as part of that effort, we've been trying to reach out to local colleges, the halls of academia, where we might find interested parties in all things philosophical, theological, religious, and otherwise.
Even the law school, like we're trying for the debate.
Did we look to law schools for
to find a couple people at Marquette Law?
Yeah, you can always find a nice pseudo-intellectual at the law school.
They just love debating.
So right. Hear themselves argue. That's a good idea. I didn't know that. Yes, of course, as part of promoting the debate, you brought it up. It's the big debate on October 21st between heavyweight champions Robert Price and Bart Ehrman, New Testament theologians and scholars nonpareil, and they will debate, of course, the historicity of Jesus itself, the big topic. And as I like to say, of course, after the debate, we'll know. We will have decided if Jesus,
debate's over.
The debate's over. Jesus will be declared to be real or imaginary at that point. And that is, of course, at historic Turner Hall. Started as a gymnasium by German immigrants.
Yeah, like the 1800s.
Did you realize that, Sean?
Yeah.
Calisthenics went on there.
Mm-hmm. You get to see all of that on the walls when you
jumping jacks, or as they say in German, jumping jacks. But now it's a beautiful concert venue. There's you can get a drink right while you're there. Of course, is the part of the theme, Buzzed Belief, being the series. This is the second in a really what's turned out to be a great idea of theological debates in a pub atmosphere, where folks can open their minds and maybe glimpse the other side for a moment. Get your tickets at mythicistmilwaukee.com. Is there any specials going on right now, Sean?
None that I can talk about at this point.
Oh, all right.
Keep your eyes out. Keep your eyes open. There will be something coming, some specials coming. But the date is October 21st, 2016.
Tell us more.
I just wanted to make sure the date is out there so they know. But yeah, you can also get online tickets if you cannot make it to Milwaukee. We will be live broadcasting the entire event. So,
will that be a larger event than the debate, than a conference too?
No, that's the are you talking about the conference part? Yeah. You just want me. You just want
I'm
people.
just prompting you.
You just want me to say that you're going to be giving a talk at the front end of the.
No,
conference?
actually, I was just trying to share the conversation so that you could tell people.
No.
It's more than just debate.
No, we're excited. We have Allie Jackson making her debut lecture. We have Thomas Smith from the Atheistically Speaking podcast making his debut lecture. We have you, Rob Moore, making your debut presentation. So yeah, we're really, really excited. So
and of course, Dan Barker. From FFRF, the man himself.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, get your tickets.
He's going to show you guys how it's done.
Yeah, he is. I'm not going to be able to play piano after he shows me how it's done. I can promise you, I'm looking forward to his ditties at the piano on October 21st. So do get your tickets now at mythicistmilwaukee.com. Today, as part of that outreach, we've actually scored a local professor. He is the assistant professor in religious studies program in the Department of History at UWM, as in Milwaukee. That's the University of Wisconsin, right here down the road. A local guy. We have him in studio. His major publications are right here next to me: the Holy Madman of Tibet and the Life of the Madman of Ü. And yes, I said Ü. His primary.
Well done.
Thank you. Well, yeah, language is my thing, but Buddhism not so much. And as I mentioned before we went on the air, we're heavy in Abrahamic religions and the Christ myth theory, and even some fringe religions before we've gotten to what really is an absolutely monster religion in the world. Please welcome to the program Dr. David DiValerio to discuss Buddhism today. How's it going, David?
Very good. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for joining us. You made your way to downtown Milwaukee and found our little crypt up here in the corner. Tell us.
It's much more spacious and airy than I was expecting.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad in here. We consider it our second living room, so welcome to it and make yourself at home.
When does the foosball start?
Yeah, it's a nice table, man. We get a little mini tournament afterwards. You have a baby face. You tell us what you, how you got into what you do, and what's your major theme there at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Okay, so first I'll start with the job, which is kind of a shorter story, and then I'll get back to how I got into all this, which is a slightly longer story. At UWM, I'm in the history department and religious studies program. I teach courses on different facets of Buddhism, intro to Buddhism, some courses on Tibetan Buddhism. I also teach religious studies courses, theories of religion. That's one that you guys would probably be very much into, where we examine religion from all different perspectives. So I teach a number of different things, and that's my job. Now, the question of how I got into all this stuff, it really goes back to sophomore year of college. I was one afternoon standing in the study abroad office and looking at the programs for the various programs that were available and thinking about where I wanted to go and study abroad the next year. And my first thought was, I should go to France because I've been studying French. And then I saw the program for a Tibetan studies program, and you got to spend a semester between India, Nepal, and Tibet. And that just seemed like a great opportunity, because when was I going to get to go to those places on my own? So sort of on a whim, although I had some interest in Buddhism and so on beforehand, I decided to go on this program, and I just had a fantastic time. It was 3.5 months of traveling and meeting people and going to some amazing places. So when I came back from that, I just wanted more. I just wanted to keep going back to Tibet, and I wanted to learn Tibetan. And it turned out that the best way to do that was to go to graduate school. So right out of college, I applied to master's and PhD programs in religious studies, and I got into one at the University of Virginia, and I spent 8 happy years there studying, and then I finished my PhD and came to UWM as a professor. So I've just kind of been in the system the whole time, but it's allowed me to go to some very interesting places and do some really fascinating stuff. So I couldn't be happier about how all that's worked out. And during this 8 years of graduate school, I spent 9 months in Tibet and then 9 months in India doing research and studying language and so on. So gotten around a good bit.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That definitely is on my bucket list. I've been to Egypt and Greece and Kenya and Rwanda, but India is definitely one of the next ones coming up. Just because, the history of religion, and when you talk about history of religion, that is one of the oldest, if not the oldest. So yeah, we're really interested in learning more about your experience out there and kind of how the culture differs, from the U.S. to India.
Yeah, I mean, of all the places I've traveled, I have to say that India is my favorite place to go, favorite place to spend time. So this is my plug here for encouraging people to go to India, especially if you have any interest in religion at all. If you're just comparing, thinking critically about them, because it's everywhere. You're walking down the street and there's temples on the street, literally, and you can see people worshiping, and it's just fascinating. So everywhere you turn, there's interesting things to see. You can go to Varanasi and see corpses being burned and all this stuff, and it's just life, and it's right there out in the open, out in the streets. So for anyone who's interested in India, and interested in religion, you have to go to India. One of the most interesting things about it is just the diversity of religions that you have there. You've got Hinduism and Islam and Jainism and Buddhism and other religions all mixing together right there in the street. Sikhism, of course. So it's all right there. So definitely make a point of getting there.
Brought to you by the India Tourism Board. This is Milwaukee Show. Thank you for that. Did you dip yourself in the Ganges, my friend?
I did. Oh. Now, well, but I sort of took a shortcut, easy way around it. So instead of jumping in the main part, which I don't think is that great of an idea for foreigners, a friend and I went traveling up to a place called Gangotri, which is near the source of the Ganges, way up in the mountains. So he and I both jumped in there. I have pictures of it. Now the issue with that is that it's very, very cold. So this is water that just a few hours earlier was a glacier, and now it's running through this mountain stream. So I jumped in there. I had all my sins cleared away. Felt great. It was also cold. But, yeah. So I can say I have jumped in the Ganges.
Awesome. Well, that's I think I'd take the cold and ice over the fecal coliform.
Oh yeah.
I think that's probably a better
I would take that,
better option there. But so you've been on your own spiritual pilgrimage. Basically, is what this amounts to. Yes.
My very own non-spiritual pilgrimage.
Spiritual pilgrimage.
No,
all right,
to me, I'm just observing.
Okay,
yeah.
All right.
That's great.
We like to bring it up. And what's your with a name like David DiValerio? I imagine you were not born Buddhist. You clearly captured your fancy. Are you a practicing Buddhist now? Did you start as a Catholic? Are you a secular Buddhist? How do you classify yourself? Where do you fall on that spiritual plane?
I classify myself as a conscious atheist, non-believer. My family, I have a Catholic background in both sides of my family. I was raised not going to church or believing in anything in particular. And then during college, I was pretty into Buddhism, especially when I got back from the study abroad thing, and I was participating in a meditation group and so on. Then once I got to graduate school after about the second semester, I was like, oh, wait. And my perspective on all those things had changed completely. So, believing in a religion is one thing, and studying it critically often takes you in a very different direction. It's a very interesting position to be in, and I'm often sort of trying to explain this to people where I'm not the least bit religious at all. Religion is kind of mysterious to me,
right,
which is all the more reason to study it.
Right.
It's something that I don't understand, so I'm going to spend my life chewing on it and trying to understand it from different perspectives, simply because it's not something that makes sense to me.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think, for whatever reason, those that travel the world more, see a lot of the world or study a lot of the religious origins tend to be atheists. I don't know if there is correlation there, but it seems to me like, and for whatever reason, atheists know more about religions than
I think that's one of those common things you hear is that the more religions you're exposed to in general leads you to at least agnosticism, because at some point you realize that they can't all be right. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
I don't know if there's
the obvious answer is that one of them isn't right, but they're all wrong.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear you say that. I didn't realize that you were an atheist prior to you saying that. So that's interesting. But definitely is fascinating. We're always kind of trying to dig to the core here and trying to figure out where all this came from. Did you happen to have any experience with Zoroastrianism when you were in India? Did you see any of the Zoroastrian temples at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I know they're around, especially sort of in the Mumbai area. I think there's a tradition of that there. But no, haven't had any contact with them.
Let's stick with Buddhism for a minute here, and being that we haven't had a whole lot of Asian religions and Eastern religions on the show, go ahead and give us a primer. You're a professor. Tell us what the Western lay person needs to know about Buddhism. Specifically, there's obviously more than one type, and give us that primer on the major types of Buddhism.
Sure. So, Buddhism has been around for 2,500 years, started some point in the 5th century BCE. And in the first 1,500 years of that history, it spread through pretty much everywhere in Asia, from India to China and Japan, then to Southeast Asia, and also to Tibet and other places as well. So as Buddhism has traveled to all these different places, it's taken completely different forms. You can look at Zen Buddhism, and you can look at tantric Buddhism in Tibet or Bhutan, And yes, from some perspective, we can say, okay, these are all Buddhism, and they fall under that category as we use the term. But you could also say, well, these are different religions, Buddhisms that fall under a big, broad category. So it really depends on what you're emphasizing and what characteristics you're going to feature in terms of your definition. So it's a hugely, hugely diverse tradition with a long, long history spreading all over the world. And now we have this new phenomenon of Westerners getting interested in Buddhism and so on. And what goes on there is that we're constructing a brand new Buddhism. Yes, there's continuity with the past, and there's aspects of it that are similar to things that have been around in Buddhism since the beginning. But we can also say that this is a new formation. This is a new type of Buddhism. And we also see that the needs and the desires and the presumptions of Westerners are then filtering back into how Asians present their religion. And it's having a whole, there's sort of a feedback loop that goes on there. So long, long history with a lot of diversity. And I love studying it and talking about it and teaching my students about it, right? So I get to teach, for example, an Intro to Buddhism course, and I get 25 kids from Wisconsin in there, and I get to spend 3.5 months trying to opening their eyes to the diversity and the richness and the interesting things of this tradition. So what could be more fun than that?
Have you seen the newer, I don't know how new it is, but the secular Buddhism that is kind of on the rise right now? Are you familiar with that term at all? Where it's essentially Buddhism, but it's like from a secular bent, and like a lot of the supernatural stuff isn't in there, but
yeah, and this is part of this long trend that's been going on for a couple hundred years now, as Westerners have become more and more interested in the religion. And there's some very famous books. There's one called Buddhism Without Beliefs, which is a perfect example of this. And we can call it there's a lot of different names we could use to refer to this movement. We can call it Protestant Buddhism,
okay,
right? Because it's Buddhism with a lot of the rituals stripped out of it, and all sort of focusing on the individual practitioner and their experience and so on. So, yes, this is a huge, huge thing. It's definitely sort of Western centric, but it's actually happening the whole world over.
Okay, wow.
Now, your primary interest has been in Tibetan Buddhism. How does Tibetan Buddhism differ from the other major Buddhism?
Right. So Buddhism actually didn't go to Tibet until late. It's actually the last place in Asia where it went, which is kind of interesting because we think of it as this bastion, this stronghold of Buddhism, which it is, but it didn't become that until...
Well, yeah, you had to climb really high to get there.
Geography has a lot to do with it. It was actually easier for Buddhism to travel up sort of west of Tibet, around Tibet, connect up with the Silk Road, and got carried all the way over to China, Japan, and Korea, and actually sort of skipped Tibet until about the 7th, 8th century when it started to come there seriously. Now, because Buddhism didn't come to Tibet until late in its history, Tibetan Buddhism reflects a whole 1,500 years of development in India before it got brought there. So there's all these different layers that are all piled on top of each other. So in Tibetan Buddhism, you have monasticism, and the idea of being a monk and following all the rules and celibacy and all that stuff, which comes from the earliest layer of Buddhism. In Tibetan Buddhism, you also have Mahayana Buddhism, which is the philosophy of emptiness, which is a radically deconstructive way of understanding all the phenomena in existence. But Tibetan Buddhism also has Tantra, which was sort of the last major development in India. And Tantra is a whole ritual system. So you have these very sort of conflicting styles of Buddhism all wrapped into one Buddhist culture. And it's very, very complicated. Wow, yeah. In addition to all of that, Tibetan Buddhism incorporates the indigenous religion of Tibet, the sort of animism, where they believe in spirits and gods and all sorts of things that are not attested to in the Buddhist canon. So it's this incredibly rich soup of all these different things coming from different sources, which makes for a very interesting and rich tradition to study. With 1,000-year history.
Well, it's definitely it's very analogous to the Abrahamic faiths. I mean, certain native tribes have woven in their native practices into Christianity, and obviously Jesus wasn't dancing around a fire, but they have that. And we're interested a lot about the origins and the myths and the supernatural figures behind religions. Could you take us to the beginning of Buddhism? I've done independent research on it, and I've seen at least 3 various Buddha figures. I wonder if you can talk to that. And there's a lot of controversy or debate over whether or not Buddha was able to do supernatural feats and that. So I was wondering if you can just kind of talk to some of the origin of this religion.
Okay. Now, it's interesting because you guys keep talking about origins and you're really fixated on it, whereas scholars of religion have we've really come to question the very notion of origins, because there are no pure origins. Everything comes from something else. So we've really, maybe 200 years ago, a lot of religious studies was talking about origins of different faiths, and we've really moved past it. But to go back to the question of the origin of Buddhism, the Buddha was a real person, right? He was a man who lived in the 5th century BCE. There's really no question of that. And if you look at different versions of his biography and different stories of his life that were articulated over time, they really differ. So the earliest stories of the Buddha, which weren't actually written, although they're only oral literature, but they weren't composed until a couple hundred years after he passed away, they present him as an ordinary man, as a human being who was born on this earth as the son of a king, who achieved, some wonderful things, and then, was able to do miracles and so on as sort of proof of what he achieved. But if you skip forward a few hundred years to later versions of the biography of the Buddha, the story gets much longer and much more complicated, and now they don't talk about just this life, but the lives he had lived beforehand. So he had been, on this course to becoming the Buddha over the course of millions of years, and the little bit that we see is just the last sort of slice of it. And in these later stories, there's a lot more sort of supernatural stuff in the story with respect to the Buddha himself. So again, it really depends on who you're, getting your story from. There's all different ways of thinking about these things. And, that a lot of modern Buddhists would say, we can strip out all the supernatural stuff and it all works just as well. And yet to a lot of traditional Buddhists, they really do believe in this sort of supernatural stuff, and that's a core, essential part of the story.
No, it was the story of him being born, his mother having a dream, and he was like implemented into her side, and then he was born of a virgin, and so that's one of the things. Like when we look at it, we're always looking for themes. So we will see, the born of a virgin. He was tempted by the evil character underneath a tree. So you start to see kind of how these things kind of like all. There's a golden thread between a lot of religions. That's kind of where our focus is.
So that's why we're into the origins. We're hoping to find out that initial myth that one dude wrote that started them all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really interesting that we're hitting on these specific points, because I was literally talking about this in class on Thursday.
Hey, it's great.
This is the second week of class.
We're going to be in your class next semester.
You guys should sign up.
That'd be great.
I take auditors.
I was going to say I get an auditing credit.
But, we're doing a unit on the biography of the Buddha, looking at different versions of it and talking about the historicity of these things and whether or not they matter. Now, they don't actually say that he was born of a virgin. He was sort of miraculously conceived, right? Because his mother has this dream of a white elephant. Some versions it has 6 tusks. Some versions they're dancing together. Some versions it just visits her. But then he's not born in the normal way through the birth canal, but he kind of pops out whole from her side.
Right.
Which is interesting. Now, some versions say that, some versions don't. It's
But
again, it's for us as scholars of religion and historians, it's not so much about whether or not it's true, but it's looking at the histories of the people who articulate these stories, and why would one group of people, formulate the story in one way and another group formulate it a different way 200 years later. So that's sort of where our focus lies.
Yeah, it's very, very similar to Islam and Christianity, how, Jesus is in Islam, Jesus is in Christianity, but their stories are completely different. But yeah, it's fascinating. And it's technically an offshoot of Hinduism, correct? Is that Buddhism, it comes after Hinduism?
So I wouldn't call it an offshoot of it, but it's definitely a response to it. In the same way that Christianity has to be understood as a response to
paganism,
and so on. Because it's sort of the claims that it's putting forward, Buddhism in this case, they only make sense if you kind of assume the basics of Hinduism, right? So everything that the Buddha was really saying about there is no true self, you have to understand that in light of the sort of, at the time, basic Hindu belief in the Atman, the soul, the self. So everything about Buddhism, you have to understand it in the context of a sort of Hindu background. So throughout the whole history of Buddhism in India, it and Hinduism are in conversation with each other, where they're drawing from each other and they're responding to each other. And big movements that happen in Hinduism, of course, end up filtering into Buddhism and sort of shaping it in different directions. So, yeah, it's not that I would say Buddhism is an offshoot of Hinduism, but it's definitely a response to it. It sort of grows up from inside.
Byproduct, maybe.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how they're related and see how some of the, even some of the traditions are similar. And, it's very interesting.
Well, here in the West, of course, Americans are exposed to Buddhism mainly in the form of their very effective ambassador, Tibetan Buddhism, that is the present current Dalai Lama. And he is, correct me if I'm wrong, assumed to be a reincarnation of the original Buddha through all the other Buddhas in between.
So no. So the Dalai Lama, here we go, I get to clarify something.
This is
perfect. The Dalai Lamas are not considered reincarnations of the Buddha, because the Buddha is gone.
Right? He's done being reincarnated.
Exactly.
Perfect, right, I get it.
He achieved total enlightenment, and he left.
Yeah.
Now, the story of the Dalai Lamas is that a Buddha, not really a Buddha, but a bodhisattva, who's sort of like a Buddha, sort of a celestial, supernatural being. The bodhisattva of compassion.
He's Buddhish.
Yeah, known as Avalokiteshvara in Sanskrit, Chenrezig in Tibetan. The story is that Avalokiteshvara, who's just the purest embodiment of compassion, was looking down on the Tibetan people, and then in the 7th century or whatever, decided to incarnate himself as the Tibetan king. And then at various times throughout Tibetan history, he's incarnated himself in different figures in order to help Tibetan people. So the first Dalai Lama was in the
coming up on October
14th
21st
century or so. So the
Hall in
current Dalai
downtown
Lama is the
Milwaukee.
14th incarnation of
Milwaukee
that
would like to
guy.
thank the sponsors
And all of those
of
guys, all
Myth Information
14 of them,
Conference 3,
are
Freedom from Religion
incarnations
Foundation,
of
the Sophia
Avalokiteshvara.
Wolf
But
Quadracci
Avalokiteshvara
Memorial
has
Fund for
incarnated
Stem
in
Cell
many
Research.
different forms.
Edwin Herbert,
So they're
author
not
of Mythos
that
Christos,
unique. There's
Atheist
many
Alliance of America,
incarnations of
Atheist
Avalokiteshvara.
Republic, godless engineers who are not Tibetan Buddhists, atheists. Do they have an equivalent? Do they still community of Milwaukee?
No, so it's only in Tibetan Buddhism that we have this tradition of following a particular individual, a particular master from lifetime to lifetime. So if you went to, say, Sri Lanka, for example, where they don't have that tradition, you'd have to ask people on the street, hey, what do you think about this Dalai Lama guy? You'd get very different answers from people. But, some of them would say, oh, he's great, and so on. Some people would say, I think this whole reincarnate Lama system is nonsense. Again, this goes back to the point I was making earlier about the diversity within the Buddhist traditions. Tibetan Buddhism is tantric. So that means they use all these texts and practices that other Buddhists throughout Asia and across the world reject as totally false. So again, huge diversity within the tradition. Buddhisms rather than Buddhism.
You brought up the word before, tantra or tantric. Expound upon that a little bit. What is Tantra? We know the phrase tantric sex, I think, is the only way that any of us know it in America. What is actually Tantra? Right.
And again, Tantra is actually one of my specialties. One of the things I sort of focused on in my training, something I talk about a great deal in my research on the Holy Madmen, because they're all about Tantra. So Tantra began, we're not really sure, people sort of disagree about when it started, in the 2nd century, in the 5th century, in the 7th century. Who knows? But at some point we have this sort of new movement, which was across Buddhism and Hinduism, and even into some of the other religions of India. And it was a new style of practicing religion. And it really was about different approaches to ritual, sort of bringing ritual back and really making it a big part of the religion. And you use these different rituals to sort of tap into existing sources of power in the universe. So pre-tantric Buddhism, if you wanted to achieve enlightenment, you had to do it on your own, where you had to look inwards and meditate and achieve this transformation. Whereas in Tantra, they say, okay, well, there's enlightened deities out there, right? There's these Buddhas who exist out there in the universe. And instead of trying to achieve enlightenment on your own, you can just try and unify yourself with that Buddha. So you visualize yourself as the Buddha.
Interesting.
You do rituals in which you act as the Buddha. You recite mantras, which sort of bring that Buddha into sort of your presence. So the idea is that if you can achieve self-identification, union with that Buddha, you can achieve enlightenment. So it's sort of like a shortcut, sort of like a workaround through all the other things you have to do. So, Tantric Buddhism presents itself as the quick path. They say, okay, you can do the old style and spend 1,000 lifetimes meditating and purifying your karma, or you can do these powerful rituals and transform yourself in just one lifetime. So that's the promise of Tantra. So with Tantra, you incorporate all these new sorts of techniques. Ritual, self-identification, the drinking of alcohol, consuming impure substances, and then this is where sex comes into it. Now, sex comes into Tantra in many different ways, and it's actually way weirder and more interesting than people even think. So Westerners, we hear Tantra, we think of sex,
right?
But we don't think of it as being about consuming sexual fluids.
Oh, wow.
Right? And that's really what it's about.
Oh.
the initiation ritual in which you become a fully formed tantric practitioner. Traditionally, the guru would ejaculate inside of his consort, and then you scoop it out, and then you put it on the tongue of the disciple. And the disciple's on his hands and knees, or he's on his knees, and he looks up and he says, "Oh, bliss." And at that moment, he's supposed to experience the taste of the guru's seed as the experience of enlightenment.
Wow.
And he's supposed to keep a pure mind. So if he thinks to himself, "Oh, this is gross," then it won't work. But if he can keep the right mindset, then he can achieve that. So a lot of tantric sex is about generating sexual fluids, sometimes using them in initiation rituals, sometimes sort of just generating it and keeping it inside of yourself. So male sexual fluid it's referred to as bodhicitta, which means the mind of enlightenment. So the whole idea of enlightenment mind has sort of become commodified in the form of semen. So much of tantric sex is about generating that semen, keeping it inside of yourself, storing it up into your brain, and that's how you achieve enlightenment.
I know that's how I refer to my semen.
Jeez, let's keep it on track.
Yeah, you got on the too much information, didn't we? Glad we asked. Right?
And this is great. You guys said we can edit stuff out.
No, this is great.
But this is what we talk about in my classes, because this is the history of the tradition.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Dan Brown should write a novel. That's shocking.
What's interesting about that is that seems to glorify the male sexual. Whatever they call it, the sexual.
Well, that's my skeptic take on it.
Yeah.
It's like this is another way to be perverted. This is a.
Is it very male driven? Is this the one thing I noticed? Like in Westerners were really ignorant to this religion in a large part, but I always thought they were very accepting of women's culture and things of that nature. And I did do some research. There are Buddhist Buddhist sects that if you're born a woman, you have to die and be reincarnated as a man. Come back as a man, then you can actually achieve enlightenment. So before you can actually achieve enlightenment, you have to actually be a man. So is that, I mean, I know there's a lot of different sects and a lot of different variations, but like, is it more male driven or, based on your experience?
Yes. And I have to say, as a scholar looking at this as objectively as I can, I have to say Buddhism is about as sexist and misogynistic as every other religion, basically. Okay. And there's a long history of this, right? And it's a very interesting point because it really goes back to a point I mentioned earlier, which is that the sort of new construction of Buddhism and the idea of Buddhism that so many Westerners have is not so much based on the truth, the reality, the historical nature of the tradition, but about our own sort of presumptions and so on. And this idea that Buddhism is less sexist than other religions is just another example of this. It's no less sexist than other religions. So if you go back to the life of the Buddha, the story is that his aunt came to him and said, "Hey, can we form an order of nuns?" And he said no. And she asked him 3 times, and finally he said yes. But he said, if we allow there to be an order of nuns, it will speed up the process by which Buddhism disappears from the world. Oh, wow. And so there's these prophecies that Buddhism would last for a certain amount of time, and then it would eventually disappear, like everything. And we said if we allow women into it as full participants, as nuns, it will speed up that process. So that's one example of sort of sexism. And at that time, they instituted a number of rules. The way seniority works in the monastic community is that everyone's lined up and they have sort of positions of honor and respect, and it's all based on how long you've been a monk. So a kid who's been a monk for 5 years outranks an old man who's been a monk for 1 day. So one of the rules that the Buddha instituted, according to tradition, when he allowed there to be an order of nuns, was that every nun has to be subservient to every monk, no matter what. So even if a woman has been a nun for 50 years, she has to bow down to a monk who's been a monk for 1 day.
Wow.
So that's sexism, pure and simple. Now, the question is, did that come from the Buddha, or is that just a reflection of the way things were in Indian culture at the time?
Right.
We can't say one way or the other, but that's just the fact. So if we get into the realm of Tantra, it's another area where people think, Westerners like to imagine that the feminine has been divinized, and it has. Mm-hmm. There are tantric goddesses, and they often say that the woman is a central part of the process, especially with all the sexual practices we were talking about. But it's still for men. Okay. It's still not really for the women to do the practices. All the tantric texts that describe the practices, it's all from the male perspective for the male practitioner. So yes, there are tantric goddesses and dakinis, and it's divinized, But that doesn't actually mean that women were treated as equal within this culture. The way it worked in Tibet, where we had lamas who had sexual consorts, was, the women were often treated sort of like commodities, where they're sort of passed around from one lama to the next.
Wow.
And women can sort of gain some power within that, because there's power that comes from that. But at the same time, it was a man's world. Yeah. So people have written different accounts and histories of this, and some Western women who've gotten into Tibetan Buddhism have written accounts of how they were treated as sexual consorts. So if people want to learn more, you can read about their experiences directly. So again, going back to my point, a lot of Westerners like to imagine that Buddhism is different.
Right.
We imagine, we say, okay, the religions that we're familiar with are sexist, and we sort of imagine that Buddhism is the opposite of that, and that's just not true.
It doesn't surprise me, the sexism part, because you don't see female monks. I mean, it's just clear throughout history. You ever watch Kung Fu Man? No monks in the school.
No, there are female nuns.
But I was going to ask, there is still a female order of nuns?
Yeah, and it really varies country by country. Some Buddhist countries in Asia have a strong order of nuns. Other places, there's sort of less of them. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's always, for the past 1,000+ years, there's been an order of monks and an order of nuns. But the nuns, they usually have it tougher. They usually don't, they're not well funded. They don't get as much money. And the logic is, well, if their karma was any good, if they really had spiritual capacity, they would have been born as men.
Jeez.
So the very fact that they are women is proof of their sort of lesser status. So, my whole thing is like, I don't want to sort of gloss over the problems with the tradition and ignore them.
Right.
Let's be honest about what it was. And this is how I see it as a historian.
Right.
You mentioned that the Westerners are fed a sanitized version, basically, and there's a trend and a kind of an fantasized ideal of a religion that's actually more peaceful and actually more loving and actually more accepting. Is there any truth to that, or is the establishment just as rife with corruption and scandal as other religions?
It's not just that Westerners are being fed this, but it's kind of what we want.
It's being assumed. Right.
That model is conforming to our sort of assumptions and desires.
Right.
And there's a whole long history of why certain Westerners have gotten into Buddhism, and it's a long history there. But yes, I mean, when I tell students in class, like, examples of throughout this 2,500-year history when Buddhism was used in the service of war, right, to justify war, to justify the slaughter of people and so on, people are always shocked. They say, I thought Buddhism was nonviolent.
Right.
Well, it is in some senses, but it's also just like other religions in terms of how it operates. And if you look at the history of Buddhism in Tibet, it's definitely tied up with a very inegalitarian social structure. Yeah, again, my whole thing is just about sort of looking at these historical truths and all of their messiness.
Well, that's what my question was, to stay on this kind of topic. When you were in India and you saw, Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and all these religions together, was there any of that bigotry amongst the religions, or did they work together pretty well, or kind of how was the culture as a result? Because one of the things I saw recently in Myanmar, extremist Buddhists. Myanmar.
Also known as Burma.
Yes, Burma.
It's not Top Gun, Sean. It's Myanmar.
Thank you. Myanmar. Yeah, the extremist Buddhist sect attacked the mosque and destroyed the mosque out there. I was curious to know if you knew anything about that.
Yeah, so there's been tension, not just tension, violence between Buddhists and Muslims in Myanmar for the past couple of years. And there's been various articles on it. I haven't looked that much into it because I'm just not surprised, right? I see a headline saying, Buddhists are attacking Muslims in Myanmar. And I just say, well, of course they are, right?
Yeah, well,
whereas other people are surprised by this.
Exactly.
That's why it shows up on the New York Times.
Right.
So that's one example. Sri Lanka had a war that lasted 30 years, and it was basically the Buddhist majority fighting against the Hindu minority. Now, it's about religion, but it's also about ethnic groups and the different languages that they speak and so on. So it's almost never purely about the religion.
Right.
It's almost always about
money,
ethnicity.
Something else.
It's about all those sort of things that are all wrapped together. And again, that gets us into the great complexity of religion and why it's so interesting, because it is connected with all these other things.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's so powerful, too, because you can have campaigns for other reasons, money, oil, whatever, but as long as you wrap it around with a bow and because Islam said so, then people actually understand, that's our mission. So it's like some people will get wrapped up in the religion part, even though there's a lot of people who understand what the actual, conflict is about. Right?
That's one of the sort of really interesting things and important things that we have to try and keep in mind as we think about how religion operates in different cultures is that, within that culture, you might have 100 people who are all nominally of that religion, but they all sort of experience it differently and think differently about how those forces are at play. And, there may be some very sort of pious, naive people who are just sort of fully influenced by it in the way that you're suggesting, but there's also people who sort of see through that.
Yep.
So, but again, it's all about a great diversity of experiencing it. And when we think about religion, especially as scholars, we tend to sort of try and put everyone into one category. But the fact is, people experience it and see all these different truths in very complex ways.
Yeah, it's so true. While you were in India, what are some of the other things you've observed that were culturally different than what some people might, perceive Buddhism in the West? We touched on the women's role in that religion, or was there anything, from the society standpoint, where was there like an upper class, a lower class type of a deal out there?
Yes. I mean, I don't really know how to answer this question because there's just too much. I mean, everything about my life there, everything that I was observing is so different from our own culture. So, you can't encapsulate India with words. You just got to go see it for yourself.
Yeah, definitely on the list.
Remember to get your tickets for Myth Information Conference 3 featuring the big debate between Robert Price and Bart Ehrman coming up on October 21st at historic Turner Hall in downtown Milwaukee. Mythicist Milwaukee would like to thank the sponsors of Myth Information Conference 3, Freedom from Religion Foundation, Sophia Wolf Quadracci Memorial Fund for Stem Cell Research, Edwin Herbert, author of Mythos Christos, Atheist Alliance of America, Atheist Republic, Godless Engineer, Kenosha Racine Atheists and Freethinkers, Atheist Community of Milwaukee, and Polaris Financial. Get your tickets now at mythicistmilwaukee.com. One of the things that's interesting about the Buddhist establishment, at least the Tibetan Buddhist establishment, is the practice of letting or forcing kids into the monastery at a very young age, and more than indoctrination. It's really I think even more insidious than that. It's
expectation.
Indoctrination to me implies something that could happen to any practitioner of the faith, but monks are being forced into a career, basically. Besides that, at age where they can't, choose, and a lot of this happens because families are desperate for something to do with children. They live in poverty. There's not necessarily orphanages, and this is a way for their kids to at least be fed and educated.
So this is a great topic. This is a topic that I spend a whole week on. I teach a Tibetan Buddhism course every year, and we spend a whole week on monasticism, trying to understand it from different perspectives. So for one day of class, I have students read the rules of monkhood and sort of trying to understand the logic from the inside of, why monks are supposed to follow all these rules about not having sex and not stealing, and from the major rules down to the minor ones. And then the other day we read an article by an anthropologist who went in the 80s to a Tibetan community and went to the monastery, and he took surveys of all the monks and asked them, how old were you when you became a monk and what were the circumstances? And you see that, yes, the vast majority of them were kids who were brought there to become monks, not by their own choosing. But this is true of religions around the world. I mean, almost everyone who's of a religion is of that religion because that's their parents, right?
That's
and
true.
Globally, the percentage of people who sort of convert and choose, I want to be of this religion, it's always historically been a tiny, tiny percentage of it. And yet we as Westerners tend to think that it's your choice.
It's a choice,
that
right?
You're of this religion because that's what you believe.
Well, we don't stick kids in the Catholic seminary at age 5 either.
Yeah, but we force kids to go to Catholic school,
right.
or parents take their kids to church every week, or
Absolutely.
whatever. So yes, the history of, in Tibet, how people become monks, it's an interesting thing. And yes, if you look at, the stories that individuals have of why they brought their kid, a son or a daughter, to become a monk, sometimes it's because they had great faith. Sometimes it's because they didn't have enough money, and it was a way to get one less mouth to feed. It's a way to get your kid an education. There's so many different reasons. Sometimes it's because the kid is orphaned, exactly as you mentioned. And, in 15th century Tibet, there were no public institutions. So the monastery sort of filled that role. So the point is that the monastery is not just a religious institution, but it's wrapped in with all these other societal things at the same time. So it just makes it more complicated. It's never just about the religion.
Yeah, I had one question. I really want to get in your books here, but just one question when it comes to Buddhism, like in the Abrahamic faiths and a lot of religions, whether or not people agree or disagree, even within the religion itself, a lot of people will say, well, they still believe in God. I can get behind that, right? So in Buddhism, is there this concept of God, or is it more, you're the God, you become enlightened, and you can, you will be the God? Like, how does that work?
So in Buddhism, there is no idea of a big supreme God. I mean, that's kind of what defines Buddhism as not Hinduism. But also, as you articulated about you becoming the God, that is not the case. Buddhism is really about realizing your own insignificance.
Okay.
Realizing that you're a bug. Realizing that you're just one among all the billion sentient beings in the universe, and you're not significant. So it's actually the opposite. It's not about divinizing yourself. It's about realizing your own insignificance, which then becomes a starting point for understanding the reality of how we fit into the whole complexes of causes and effect that make up the world.
Did you notice any conflict or any awkward situations with those in Buddhism in India to those that were like in Islam, or those that really do believe in the creator God? Is that like a topic of debate at all? Or
I mean, I'm sure it is among some circles, people who are purposefully seeking out those sorts of debates. But the fact is, what I was observing most of the time is these are people who live together in the same village. Yep. And there's the Muslim family and the Hindu family and then the Buddhists. And the Buddhists, in this case, are Tibetans who are living in exile. And everybody already knows who the other people are. So they don't really debate about it. They just they go through their lives. Yeah. And I think that, if you look at examples of religious violence and people fighting with one another and so on, as you keep sort of alluding to, it's very rarely about the beliefs themselves. Right. It's usually about all the other issues that go along with it.
Right. Well, I think that's what's interesting.
So to go back to the example of India, as I was saying, there's definitely ethnic tensions.
Yeah.
Right. There's some, when you have a group like the Tibetans living in India among a different population, sure, that there can be people who are friends. There can also be tensions and so on.
Right.
So it would be about that rather than about the religion itself.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's interesting because in the West, in the U.S., the Buddhism is growing in popularity. And it's interesting, for people that would consider themselves as cultural Christian, moving to a religion that doesn't have a creator God. I mean, that is... obviously we came out as atheists and stuff, but that's almost kind of like the first step, in my opinion.
Well, I think that's part of the fascination. That's part of what makes it trendy among the hip Californians to be into that thing. You can call yourself an adherent of an atheistic religion, and in a sense, and still be spiritual. I think it really fills that gap.
I agree
for a lot of people, or people who don't want to let go of that idea that there's something more to us that we can't put our finger on because it's not quite science yet.
They don't want to say they're an atheist.
The metaphysical is there for them, but they don't want to say. They don't want to say they're an atheist, but they don't want to give up control to some. All-knowing supreme deity who clearly doesn't give a shit.
Or they don't like their religion.
What's going on down here? But I do want to take it back to the monasteries, if I could, and ask the tough question. There's a vocal minority of people who are trying to expose sexual abuse at the hands of older monks and masters, and of course it's not hard to predict in a forced celibacy atmosphere where younger students have no choice and no voice and no support from home. This kind of thing might happen. Is there? It's
a Catholic Church.
It's a Catholic Church kind of thing over again, where the Dalai Lama is in a position where he can't expose it for fear of completely collapsing the financial underpinnings of the whole operation. In effect, becoming a really bad Buddhist by lying about something that maybe he knows. Are you aware of that at all? Have you seen any of the stories that have leaked a little bit YouTube about these? Cultural abuse in these monasteries.
I don't know any of these particular stories that you're referring to about sort of things getting leaked and so on, but none of that surprises me. Of course that's part of the tradition. There are plenty of throughout the history of Tibetan Buddhism, we're talking about 1,300 years of history, and in old Tibet there were tens of thousands of monasteries. That's a lot of monks. It was something like what was it? 10% of the population in old Tibet were monks.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a phenomenon called mass monasticism. Tibet had like 10 times more monks than any other Buddhist culture. It was so huge. Every family pretty much sent monks. There are even times and places in Tibetan history where families were obligated to send a monk basically as a tax. And that's not universally true, but there are times and places where that was the case. So if you think of all those people who were monks, some of them are very earnest and very driven by the religion, and some of them are just there because that's where they are. And within that, you get all different sorts of behavior. So sexual abuse has always been part of the tradition. No one really talks about it.
No.
So I don't know what you're referring to with these sort of recent movements to sort of expose that, but yeah,
I just want to bring it up. We do try to be relevant and topical and kind of expose the harm done by religion. And Buddhism has a very sanitized public image in America.
It's just like the Catholic Church. I mean, you have some priests that are terrible people, and you have some that are fantastic people that help the community and work with the community. It's a shame. It's a shame that small percentage.
Well, hopefully we'll see Peter in a little while, but of course we know firsthand of the abuse here in America at the hands of the Catholic Church, but at least it has been exposed, and there are people putting this out in the public forum. And the
spotlight.
The worry is that these kids in small countries in the Himalayas don't have any voice, and nobody's looking at it at all. So if it's down to Mythicist Milwaukee to shed a light on
now, can I use this to tie into talking about my book?
Absolutely, perfect.
Let's do that.
It actually ties in perfectly.
Perfect.
Yes,
okay,
perfect.
so I'm going to give a little bit of a spiel here, but I promise I'm going to connect it back to what we were just talking about. To my first book, The Holy Madmen of Tibet. It's a revised version of my dissertation. So I started doing this research in 2008, and throughout the past 1,000 years in Tibetan Buddhism, we've had different times individuals who became prominent, who were renowned and respected, essentially as saints, who are also called Nyumba, which means madman. And it's the same term, Nyumba, that we use for regular crazy people, for mad dogs. So the term has negative connotations, but with respect to these individuals, it gets sort of inverted and it becomes a positive thing. So these madmen are famous for doing crazy things. So they would, everyone is different, but some of the things they're renowned for doing is walking into the marketplace and taking off their clothes.
Okay.
Or one story of a figure called the Madman of Ü, who lived from 1452 to 1507, described in his biography written in 1512, is that he's walking through the marketplace with feces in one hand and brown sugar in the other, and he's eating from both at the same time. Which, when people observe that, they say, and whether or not he actually did that, I have no idea, but it's the story.
Well, what are you supposed to eat with feces?
But the point is, people observe that and they say, okay, this is not normal behavior. A regular person wouldn't do it. This guy's doing it. Something's different about him. But it comes to signify enlightenment, because ordinary people live by categories like pure and impure, clean, not clean.
Right.
But in the truth of emptiness, which is an important idea in Buddhism, everything is the same, because everything is empty of its own inherent existence. Everything is relative to the perspective of the viewer. So by doing this behavior, the Madman of Ü is signifying to people that he's transcended the worldly categories that we ordinary folks live by.
Is this the concept of crazy wisdom, by where the actions of an inscrutable genius master cannot be understood by a mere mortal?
So crazy wisdom is a particular formulation of this idea put out by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, important Tibetan Lama in the U.S., who was big in the 80s and 90s, or in the 80s especially, 70s and 80s, I guess. And I talk a lot about him in Chapter 7 of the book at the end, showing how, what he's doing in this articulation of, crazy wisdom. Yes, he's drawing from this whole tradition, but it's also his own formulation of it, because in every instance, these madmen are using this in different ways. So he keeps talking about it as if it's this universal truth. And I'm instead trying to describe it as a cultural phenomenon. Holy madness, I see, is a trope that's existed in Tibetan culture throughout time, through the past 1,000 years. But again, going back to the point I wanted to make to connect back to what we were talking about before, one of the madmen I focus on in the book is a man named Drukpa Kunle. He was known during his lifetime as Druknyön, which means the madman of the Drukpa sect, one of the sects of Tibetan Buddhism. But since then, he's become really popular in Bhutan. So he's known by a lot of people as the Madman of Bhutan. And if you go through Bhutan, there's all these stories of him doing crazy things, smashing demonesses with his penis and giving an old man a version of the Buddhist refuge prayer to recite with everything inverted. So you're, bowing down to the old woman's flaccid vagina as opposed to bowing down to the Buddha. So Drukpa Kunle is famous for doing all this crazy stuff. And, Bhutanese people and Tibetan people love telling stories about him. Just the craziest scatological, iconoclastic stuff that you can imagine. Now, what I argue in chapter 6 of the book is that the real Drukpa Kunle, as far as we can tell based on historical sources, was none of those things. The real Drukpa Kunle, as far as I can tell, was a guy who was a monk and then renounced his monkhood, and then he started writing. And in the course of his writings, he would criticize the religious culture of his day. So he would write about the different sects and how corrupt they were in different ways. And in the course of that, he would mention, he would suggest sexual abuse, where he would say, oh, it's great being a monk because you've got those little monks around to excite your desires. So he was saying this among all sorts of things. And the fact that he was saying it is pretty remarkable. I don't think we have too many sources from the 15th century that mention stuff like this. So what I argue is that Drukpa Kunle was sort of a nonconformist, but really he was a critic. And he was criticizing and exposing all the different types of corruption that he saw in the religious system around him. And then in the 500 years that have passed since then, the stories of him have just become amplified and amplified. And instead of him writing criticisms, it's sort of become literalized in these stories. So people have this idea of Drukpa Kunle today as this wild thing, whereas the actual Drukpa Kunle, I think, was much tamer and much more grounded and much more interesting, honestly. But a big part of how that change took place was he signed a lot of his writings, the Madman of the Drukpa, Druknya. But I think he was using it as a pen name.
Okay.
We can call ourselves a madman, whatever.
Sure, right? He thought it was clever.
Yeah, he thought, and there was a long tradition of calling yourself a madman in Tibetan writings. A lot of poets call themselves the madman of this place, the madman of that place. So over time, his use of the term madman sort of got changed, and people started to think of him in different ways, and they started to take him as a madman much more literally. So that's an example of the sorts of things I'm talking about in the book, is looking at the history of this tradition of Tibetan quote-unquote madmen and looking at the human beings behind the stories.
Right. Yeah, the history is always a lot different than the legend, but it's always more interesting.
He sold me on the book. I'm going to read it. If you're going to leave these with us, I'll read that one. I like this.
Absolutely.
I like the sound of that. Now, they both have, that's the madmen, so it's a look at the tradition and several madmen. That's in the plural. Your other book is The Life of the Madman of Ü, and I made fun of that before because it's just one letter, and it's Ü mit Umlaut.
So the first book, the Holy Madmen of Tibet, which came out in the summer of 2015, that studies and it examines the lives of a few dozen madmen throughout history. But it really focuses most of the book on the 15th century when we had three very famous madmen who all lived at the same time. So within 6 years, between 1452 and 1458, the three most famous Tibetan madmen of all time were all born. The Madman of Tsang, who I mentioned earlier, Drukpa Kunle, who I was just talking about, and the Madman of Ü. So when I realized that these three madmen were born at the same time and that they knew each other and that they wrote letters back and forth and that they probably met one another, according to their biographies, for my research, I was like, okay, I need to focus on this time period and see what was going on then that would prompt this madman movement. So the Madman of Tsang, who I mentioned earlier, the guy who was eating feces and brown sugar walking through the marketplace, according to his biography, he's also the author of the most famous piece of Tibetan literature ever written called The Life of Milarepa. So Milarepa is a famous saint from the 11th century, the most famous Tibetan saint of all time. And the Madman of Tsang wrote this biography of him in 1488 and published it and was really promoting it, which is not the behavior of a madman, right? And to me, that really suggests a real self-awareness on his part about his own saintliness, right? For a person to write the biography of another saint and then get it printed through woodblock printing and spread copies of it all over Tibet, that to me suggests that the Madman of Tsang was thinking about how people would think about him and how his behavior would reverberate throughout history, through literature, and so on. So the second book, The Life of the Madman of Ü, focuses on the third of those three madmen, the one who was born in 1458. It tells his story. So the Tibetan text was written in two parts, in 1494 and then 1537. The first part, it came out when he was 36 years old, when he was still sort of in the middle of his career as a saint and was still sort of rising in prominence, which is pretty unique. Usually when we have the biography of a saint, it's not written until after they pass away.
Right. So
it's kind of a unique case. So yeah, I translated the whole biography. It tells the story of him being born in a family of serfs. him running away from home and becoming a monk, and he's a monk for a number of years, and then he gives up his monkhood and starts taking on this madman lifestyle, and eventually he settles down and just founds a monastery, which is a very conservative thing to do. But his whole thing was meditating. He lived for 75 years. I think he spent about a quarter of his life in meditative retreat. So living in caves, often isolated or semi-isolated. There's one point from around 1502 to 1512, he stayed in a sealed retreat for 10 years at his monastery. So he's basically sealed inside of a room.
Wow.
And
he imprisoned himself. Almost.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. And he would only interact with the world through a hole.
Wow.
So it would say that his disciples would come and they would sit outside and he would be inside and he would talk to them through this hole. So he's, exactly as you said. And we call monks' rooms a cell, right? So he put himself in his cell for 10 years.
Wow.
That's how dedicated he was to his practice. So that's
how mad he was.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to wrap your mind around.
Yeah.
But I mean, that definitely gets your message out, I mean, like, it's almost kind of like the Forrest Gump story where he starts doing a bunch of bizarre things and people are following him because they don't know what's coming next and they see him as some kind of guide. I mean, it's a bad analogy.
As long as he had a cell signal in his cell, couldn't have been that bad.
But I mean, I would, so my whole thing with my study of these saints is I would apply the same thinking to saints of any religion.
Yeah.
I was going to touch on that. I didn't know, not to interrupt you, I didn't know there were saints in Buddhism. Tell us how that works.
Some people might say that we shouldn't call them saints. Some people say, saint is such a Christian term that we shouldn't use it in regard to other religions. But if we sort of step back and say, okay, as scholars and historians, we can observe that these are individuals who are praised by others and worshipped as holy because of their religious accomplishments.
So they don't necessarily call them saints.
Well, in Tibetan, they would be called, generally they were called druptop, which means siddha, which is a tantric term for basically an enlightened being with special powers, with superpowers.
I'm going to call you Droopy Sean from now on.
Well, that's, and the whole saint concept really was taken from the pagan, the multiple gods in paganism, but in Catholicism, you can have multiple gods. Sure. So, you created saints and angels and things like that.
I assumed as a teenager that's why they were saints.
So, the saints were, their lives were embellished. And
you pray to them and they answer your prayers. Is that not a god? I mean,
it's typically in Catholicism. I mean, that's,
Interesting.
So anyway, what I'm doing with these, study of these 15th century Tibetan quote unquote saints is, it's using a methodology that I think we can apply to studying saints of other times and places. So, looking at the careers of Christian saints, for example. So, one author whose work you guys might be interested in, who I draw from a lot, his name is Aviad Kleinberg, and he has a book called Prophets in Their Own Country about early Christian saints.
Okay.
Not early, I guess late antiquity or whatever. And he sort of looks at how their reputations were formed and how, in many cases, the people around them didn't know how to respond to them. And he tells stories of one woman who eventually became a saint, and there was a community of people around her who worshipped her, but her own family was like, she's just our weird daughter who always had something wrong with her.
Right.
So just sort of by looking at the different ways that people responded to a saintly figure in the historical moment can really give you a lot of depth and understanding how, their holiness was not obvious to everybody. It was something that people responded to on an individual case-by-case basis. So this is kind of the methodology that I use in looking at the history of the madmen.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Yeah, that's
how are we doing on time? Probably getting about to...
I think we are...
To the hour. What I wanted to ask you, you've got an inscription. I'm a language guy. Do you speak some Tibetan now? You fluent?
Yes. So... about when I was in grad school for 8 years, and pretty much half of what I was doing was studying languages, so Tibetan and Sanskrit, classical Tibetan and modern spoken Tibetan. My Tibetan is a little bit rusty these days, but I used to speak Tibetan fluently. I had, when I was living in Tibet, I would have periods of a month or so where I was just living with Tibetan people and didn't have any opportunity to speak English. And when I go back to India, it sort of comes back. So yeah, I love speaking Tibetan. It's one of my favorite things to do.
Now, is it closer to the Indian languages, or is it closer to the Chinese?
It's this is an interesting point. It kind of has a long answer. I'll try and be quick about it. The Tibetan written language is based on Indian scripts and Indian writing systems, but in terms of like the grammar and the actual language itself, there's a real debate over Tibetan's connections with other languages. Some people believe that there's a Proto-Sino-Tibetan language group and that ultimately Tibetan is related to Chinese. Other people reject that and they say instead there's a Tibeto-Burman language tree. So if you look at different language trees that sort of map all the languages of the world, some have Sino-Tibetan and some have Tibeto-Burman. And there's so much politics connected with this question, about justifying the Chinese presence in Tibet. So it's kind of hard to get a straight answer from people. And there's so much at stake in this question that I don't really trust anybody. So I'm not an expert in the history of Tibetan linguistics, and I'm sure there are other people who can give a more refined answer, but there's a debate over it.
Oh, interesting. Hey, that's a good question.
So, again, it all comes back to politics.
It's fascinating
well,
stuff.
I just wanted to thank you because, one of the things this group does is we really feel confident that education really is the way to a more tolerant world. We think if you're religious or not, if you start learning more, and if we can start introducing people to more concepts, they start seeing like how all religions are kind of connected. So instead of this inherent bigotry, you can almost kind of see more respect for one another. So it's great that you're doing what you do. I haven't seen, I've seen like maybe a handful of religious courses at UWM. I might be off base on that, but I haven't seen many. But yeah, we really appreciate and respect what you're doing at UWM.
Yeah, so we have, a religious studies program with me and, a number of other faculty who are teaching courses in this area, and we all have very different approaches and different sort of messages that we're trying to get across. But, if a student majors or minors in religious studies, they're going to take a whole range of courses, and it's going to open up their minds to very different ways of thinking about these things.
We agree 100%. But David, thank you so much for joining us.
David DiValerio, ladies and gentlemen, and
check him out if you're in Milwaukee. Sign up for one of his courses. It's just every year, essentially.
Yep, every semester.
Every
I'm teaching
semester.
different courses. So look me up.
Awesome,
fascinating. Join us again for the next episode when we talk to Norm Allen.
Norm Allen, one of the first black early atheists. It's an awesome thing. Yeah. I mean, when you talk about the African American culture, it's definitely very, very tough to get atheists to come out. So it's really respectable what he did and what he started. So
and the fact that he was so far ahead of the curve on it.
So exactly.
So check that out on the next episode of the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. Take it easy, everybody.
Thank you.
The Mythicist Milwaukee Show is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee. Producer Sean Frasek. Associate producer Melanie Lawson, engineer Jason Lawson, Mythmeister Antonio Blandone, researcher Kristen Whitaker-Hood. Closing theme written and performed by Shelley Siegel. On behalf of co-host Brian Edward and the entire team, I'm Rob Moore reminding you to keep it safe and keep it secular.
And who will be the